24 games in 2 days, 32 teams competing for the final 8 spots, 16 teams all vying for the honor of the national championship. Welcome into the 2018 ACHA D3 National Tournament Preview, the last stop on the road to Columbus. I'm ACHA D3 Chief of Broadcasting Shawn Bednard. Alongside me, Lou Gamelin, voice of the ACHA Power Play. Getting our final look in at the regional tournaments before we look at the national preview. We have had so much fun in these regional tournaments, so much excitement, and we're going to have to break all of that down as we look at the pools heading into the national tournament. Before we get that underway, this is the ACHA D3 National Tournament Preview. Looking down the alphabet, we will start with Pool A here. A pool that has a good mixture of speed, I think, was the big, strong element for them, but they've got a lot of high scores. Cam Smith of George Mason, the leading goal scorer in the entire country. Dalton Sutherland of Central Michigan, the leading point getter in the entire country. A first-timer in George Mason making their way. The highest seed in Georgia Tech making their way here. There is so much fun in this first pool, and it's a great way to start off. Lou, take us down a little bit through this Pool A. Like we said, Air Force, Central Michigan, George Mason, and Georgia Tech, your 1 through 4.
Well, first off with Georgia Tech, I'm going to go with number 4, only because they're on a roll right now. They were the underdog. They're going to come in as the underdog. They're playing on what we like to call house money. We know a team from a couple of years ago that played on house money that made it all the way to the Final Four, being Central Michigan. There's a lot to be said about that. They get a hot goaltender, and I think they're gonna give a team like Air Force, in my opinion, a tough game right from the get-go. We're gonna see what Air Force is made of. Coach Tim Hartshey's team, they're disciplined. They've got one of the best, probably one of the best goaltenders in the country in John Gannon. That is a matchup that I'm really excited to see. But then you've got 2 high-scoring, freewheeling teams in Central Michigan and George Mason. Dalton Sutherland, what can you say about the leading point getter in the country? 111 points. That's Zach Massa type numbers. And, you know, they've been there before. They've been to the Final Four. They feel they may have gotten slighted last year. That chip is on their shoulder, Shawn. It's a great region. They're all great regions, but I'm really interested in this one.
And Lou, you talked about it. I mean, we talk about that Georgia Tech team. They were 4 wins last season. That's all they had. And I think you talk about this pool, there's so much balance because Air Force was the #1 team in the country for a long time there. And they play in a very tough Pacific region, especially with the travel that they have to do. We talked about how legitimate is this Pacific Coast? How legitimate are those teams from Colorado? Colorado Mesa, they got bounced in the first round, and it looked like it was going to be some intrigue over there. But, you know, this region has, or excuse me, this pool has so much fun in it because Central Michigan, a team that was number 12 in the North last year. Georgia Tech, like we said, a 4-win team. George Mason's never been there before. And I want to talk about Georgia Tech because you just hit on them. They've outscored opponents 136-70 this year. But more importantly than that, they were able to ride an 8-2 streak to end their regular season, and they almost overcame in a sweep Kennesaw State. Now, Kennesaw State didn't fare too well in regionals, but I think that's a lot of good to see. And, you know, we expect a lot from the South region from Georgia this year. And Georgia Tech both made it to the national tournament this year. The team that we thought would be a lock for the national tournament in Kennesaw State got bounced in that first game of regionals, and it kind of makes you wonder how legitimate that Georgia team is when this is a Florida-ran conference. Is Georgia Tech a for-real team at that #8 kind of sleeper spot from regionals now to #4 in Pool A?
Well, I really think that they are for real. You got to keep in mind they don't have the gaudy win percentage that some of these teams like Central, Michigan State, or Farmingdale. But the competition down there, they beat each other up. I mean, you look at some of the teams like Florida Gulf Coast and Central Florida, their win percentage is, you know, not much over 500, especially Central Florida. So if they can, like I said, momentum's key with Georgia Tech. You mentioned it, 8-2 in the last 10. If they can keep that up and they can catch Air Force possibly looking ahead of them, we've seen it in nationals, Shawn. You get a hot goalie, you get somebody, they're on a roll. I really like Georgia Tech to really make some noise in that pool.
Air Force is a very fun one to look at as well when you mention them with Georgia Tech. Air Force, speedy, high scoring, great goaltender. I will say that until the day I die. John Gannon, he will lead this team if they want to make it to the next round. He's going to be going up against a pretty stiff goaltending competition on that final day of pool play in Riley Morgan, the winningest goaltender at the ACHA D3 right now in this regular season. And that Central Michigan team, like you talked about, they're nothing to mess with. They have one of the best scoring lines in the entire country in that top line. Ryan Tyre, Nate Allgaier, and Dalton Sullen. Great goaltending play as well. But I do want to talk about George Mason. They blew out their first day opponent of Delaware 7-4, and a very tough game, too, against Fordham, a 3-2 win. Their leading goal scorer, Cam Smith, 72 goals on the season. Most game-winning goals in the country at 7, and most power play goals at 16. The first date that those two teams have against each other is the first day. George Mason, Central Michigan, take us through that one.
Well, of course, it's going to be like a game plan where if you can stop the leading scorer for them, you're going to be able to, you could have some success. And I think that's going to be Central Michigan's MO. I mean, we see it when they play Oakland. You know, Zach Massa, you know, he's the guy. If you can contain him, you've got a shot at beating Oakland. Not slighting the other players on George Mason, but I really think if you can contain him, you've got a good opportunity to make some hay. And I think Central Michigan, you know, they've really got a lot to play for, and I think they've got some, you know, memories of a couple of years ago when they made it, or they made it to the Final Four. I really think with the firepower they can do it.
I think among any other pool, and it's a cliche to say that you can win it all on day one, but you can certainly lose it all on day one. Day one will be no more telling in any other pool than Pool A. I'm very excited to see Air Force, Georgia Tech, and that Central Michigan George Mason game. Well, all I got to say is watch out for those scoring numbers. When we come back, we will take a look at Pool B here on the ACHA D3 National Tournament Preview. Inside Chippewa Club Hockey airs every day at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. on Charter 189.
Something catch your eye? Tonight's gonna be perfect. I can feel it. Nothing could go wrong.
There's my birthday girl. Did you really expect things to work out?
I just wanted one good night.
Welcome back to the ACHA D3 National Tournament Preview. Take it back to Sesame Street. B is for balance, and that's what we see in Pool B. Michigan State, New Mexico, Central Florida, and Quinnipiac. You're 1 through 4. Michigan State, one of the best teams in the country, playing in the MCHC Tournament Championship this coming weekend. New Mexico, that auto bid from the Pacific. Central Florida, a team that I think has a lot to prove with after their regional tournament. And Quinnipiac, another champagne bottle popped. Pool B, break it down for us a little bit, Lou.
Well, of course, you've got Michigan State, at times the #1 ranked team in the country. In the Western Division of the MCHC, they were on top of that division as well. They got the auto bid, well deserved. Quinnipiac at number 4. You look at them on paper, the thing that's interesting, they've been outscored by 21 goals over the year, but they played in the Empire Conference. All 4 of their teams made it to the regionals at least, and they went through as the 3 seed. They beat a Rowan team, which I had picked to go to nationals. Central Florida, third toughest schedule or fifth toughest schedule in the country. A very balanced record, as I mentioned. And of course, New Mexico, 18-4-1, Shawn. They've outscored their opponents 143-69. Again, a very balanced pool. One that, on paper though, I think Michigan State may have a slight edge.
Okay, and you talk about that slight edge. They did win the national championship in 2015. They've been knocking on the door to make it back to the national tournament since then, but they've had no success in finding their way back. New Mexico, another one of those teams that is finding their way to their first ever national tournament. How do you like that as an auto bid? We talk about Central Florida, and you talked about how they play in a very tough conference in the SCHC. And I mean, that's Florida Gulf Coast territory. They played them in the championship game for the SCHC, and you know that's tough. That's a tough place to play in. But they kind of had, and I hate to do this to anybody, especially knowing how hard regionals is. No matter where you are, 3 or 10, but some would say that they did have the easier route. They took on number 9 Tampa and smoked them 5-1. But in that regional final game, they took on Florida Atlantic, and I want to talk about them a little bit. They beat them 2-1 in double overtime. Some would say that that does not look great for them heading into the national tournament, but Florida Atlantic played 5 overtime periods in 2 days, including upsetting the 3 seed in Kennesaw State. Is Central Florida for real?
Oh, I think they're for real. You mentioned it. They play in one of the toughest conferences in the country, I think. And that South brand of hockey is fast and it's physical. With Central Florida, you got to give them credit. They know what it takes to get there. They've been in the national tournament before. My X factor is going to be New Mexico. You mentioned it. First time for them. What is it going to be? Are they just going to be happy to get there, or are they going to be able to ride that and beat a Central Florida team and then go up with, again, as I mentioned, one of the top teams in the country in Michigan State? Are they going to be able to hang with those guys?
New Mexico, their road warriors, I talked about a lot in the regional reveal show. I think this team is going to be a team that's really hungry to compete, and especially since we're talking about Michigan State and how they only have 2 losses at the ACHA D3 level this year. That's to Central Michigan, that's to Hope, the only team that beat those 2 teams in the regular season. New Mexico, those road warriors, talk about that Pacific region a little bit, especially in the context of knowing Air Force was the #1 team out of that region.
Well, you're right. They played everywhere from Texas to Arizona up to Colorado, and it's going to be the one thing to keep in mind is they're going to be relaxed in playing in Columbus because, you know, I've talked with their coaching staff. Grant Harvey told me before, a lot of times they will go 15 to 16 hours in a car or a bus and get out, and they've got to play in 2 hours. So getting there early, you know, getting accustomed to the surroundings and being able to rest for like 2 or 3 hours before a game, that's going to be huge, and that's a big plus for them. But again, I'm still very interested to see if they're just, you know, happy to be there, or, I mean, not everybody's just happy to be there, but some teams, you know, once they get there, they just take a collective sigh and go, all right, we've made it. Will they be able to carry that momentum with the break? You know, they've been off for a while too. That's one thing to keep in mind.
I think a first day matchup against Central Florida is going to be really good for them to get their legs back under them. Central Florida, a team that we talked about, maybe not the hardest path through regionals, but the regular season speaks for itself. The SCHC, the South, which is one of the speediest conferences, and Pacific is starting to pick up in its speediness out there. If New Mexico and Air Force are any indication of that, and the teams that we'll be talking about later on for the Pacific, that just shows how fun this is going to be. Quinnipiac, 3-2 wins in both games in regionals. That first game's against Michigan State. That's a tough brand of hockey to have to start yourself off with in your first ever national tournament game. But I think that first day is going to be a lot of fun for those 2 teams. But I think the money day in that region, I think it's more so day 2 or day 3. I cannot wait for that New Mexico-Michigan State game. This is going to be a lot of fun, though. Pool B is a lot of balance, and I'm excited to see how that finishes up.
Oh, I agree real quick. Watch out for Quinnipiac with a 16-point leading score. I don't know how they're going to match up against Michigan State.
From B to C we go, and in that Pool C, we're looking at a lot of scoring. You start off with the Empire Conference's darling child, Farmingdale State. 3 straight trips to the national tournament for them. Georgia, back in it for the first time, the best time in a long time. Nebraska, getting to pop their champagne bottles as well. And how about this as your 4 seed? The defending national champion from 2 years ago, the last ACHA D3 team to win it as Aquinas went NAIA this year. Their 5th straight trip to the national tournament. That's Farmingdale State is 1, Georgia is 2, Nebraska as 3, Oakland is 4. We're going to start off with the top here. Farmingdale State, we love to talk about this team. one loss all season. Break down the Rams for us.
Oh, Farmingdale State, as you mentioned, one loss, and they are the Empire Conference champions. Goaltending, to me, is the thing that really steps out. Is they've got, they one goaltender leading the country in goals against average, and the other one is 17-1. Then you've got, again, they're a high-flying team. Joe Mazey's squad, they've been knocking on the door the last couple of years, and we've talked about them. The one thing that they have to guard against is that hiccup. They have one game where they have two bad periods and it ends up costing them the game that possibly gives them the chance to go to the Final Four. So that's the thing that's going to really be my test for them is, can they stay focused for 3 straight games? They've got the talent to do it, Shawn. It's just, can they keep the focus?
Nebraska, a team that I really want to talk about as well. We'll get to Georgia in just a minute. SEC-HC regular season champions. A third-place finish, though, in the SEC-HC tournament. The team that won that all is Arkansas, and they're in a couple of pools that we'll talk about just a little bit later on. But Georgia, their first time in a while. The Bulldogs were very hungry from last year. And are we going to see that same stumble that we saw last year at regionals where they won 1 and 2 in pool play?
Well, I'll tell you what, if they talk to Rick Emmett, or if they listen to Rick Emmett, their head coach, they're not going to stumble. They're going to be focused. They will have that in the back of their minds when they first step out on the ice next Tuesday. I don't see them that being an issue from like it was last year. To me, though, the problem is, in my opinion, they're in the toughest pool. And, they've got teams like Oakland and Nebraska, who Oakland, of course, winning it all 2 years ago. They made it to, in essence, the Final 8 last year, and they had one bad period. That's in the back of their minds as well. And Nebraska with Jordan Hank, 84 points. That is a loaded pool, in my opinion. They're really going to have to block last year out of their mind, or else they're going to be going home early just like last year. Well,
a lot of people like to say it too. Playoffs is the whole start of a new season, and for Nebraska, it's certainly been that. They had the highest goal differential in regional play, 11-1 over number 9 Northern Arizona, and a very strong 6-3 win over Wisconsin-Milwaukee. But that Nebraska team, Jordan Hank, like you said, 84 points on the season. Evan Johnson, 67 points, 2 of the top 20 scores in the entire country. Nebraska looks very strong. And another part of this region that's so tough, another part of this pool that has so much strength is that Oakland team. Like you said, Final 8 last year. They're in the Michigan Collegiate Hockey Conference Final 4. They have the MCHC MVP and Zach Massa back and looking better than ever with a hat trick in that regional final against Indiana. They narrowly avoided a very physically tough Indiana Tech team, though, in that first day, just winning by 1 goal against a 9 seed. I'm going to tell you, it's not scoring I'm concerned about. We named this the scoring pool for a reason. I think all these teams can put up double digits in a Nationals game, very honestly. The big thing I'm concerned about with Oakland, my big red X against them, is their goaltending play. They have 2 goalies that have played about the same amount of time between Cody Dennison and Austin McCardle. Neither of their goals against average is great. Their save percentages aren't good. The difference maker, if Oakland did want to move on, would have to be their goaltending play. And you mentioned it. Farmingdale State, a phenomenal goaltender. That's their day 1 matchup. Farmingdale State has the largest goal differential of any team at the ACHA D3 level, 4.95. And that's playing in the Empire Conference, who brought 3 teams to the national tournament this year, and one that didn't make it in Southern Connecticut State was in it last year. I don't know about this Oakland team. I know what they look like, and it's so hard to say, and it might come back to bite me because of how good they can be in the national tournament. But I think if Oakland want to move on, they have to have that defensive pressure in front of their own net, block those shots.
Well, I'll tell you what, I picked Oakland to win it all for a reason. And that's because they've been there. They've got a lot of the players back from that national championship team 2 years ago. Nebraska, you talk about a team that plays with a chip on their shoulder. They felt that they've been slighted for the last couple of years in the rankings, and they felt that maybe they should have been closer to an auto bid this year. So they're really going to play with a chip on their shoulder. But Shawn, Oakland to me, until you knock them off, they're my dark horse for this whole tournament. I love Farmingdale State. Joe Mazey's team is so close to getting in, and again, Georgia being there. But Nebraska's the unknown to me. I know they won the MACA. Is that going to translate in the national tournament? That's what I'm waiting to find out. I know they're going to play with an edge, but again, Oakland, Zach Massa, you've got Michael Ryan, all of those kids. Steve Laurel, they've been there. They know what it's like to hoist the trophy. Boy, it's going to be a tough pool.
Let me backtrack a little bit. Oakland did have the toughest schedule of the remaining teams at the national tournament. The hardest in the ACHA National Tournament, 5th hardest in the entire country. Obviously playing in the MCHC, that boosts the strength of schedule a little bit. You talked about the game that you want to do the most at the ACHA National Tournament. The game you're going to be doing, Oakland versus Farmingdale State, that could tell a lot. We'll take a look at Pool D when we come back, but Pool C, that's Lou Gamelin's Pool of Death. A lot of fun coming up in my Pool D prediction here on the ACHA D3 National Tournament Preview.
This semester, MHTV presents Nobody Watches Season 3. A show with questionable quality and, more stuff. Nobody Watches Season 3, airing Mondays at 1 and 8 p.m., greeting you with new episodes every other week.
Central View. Many stories, one show.
Hi everyone, I want to talk to you about MHTV's returning show, Downtime. Downtime's a show all about video games and anime, where every week me and my friends sit down and we talk about some of the biggest topics in gaming. Alongside that, we pick an anime that's airing this season and break down the episodes. So, if you have any interest in video games or anime, I highly recommend Downtime. It airs every day at 12 p.m. and 7 p.m., with new episodes airing every other Monday. You can also follow us at Twitter at Downtime TV or check out our episodes on MHTV's Vimeo page.
Enroll, we say, we want you to be okay. Enroll, we say, take care of people for goodness sake. There's a plan for every budget, so don't accept defeat. Now you can get covered and still buy me treats.
You take care of your pets. Now it's their turn to take care of you. Visit getcoveredamerica.org to learn about your health insurance options.
One more pool to look over, and they're my pool of death. Lou picked C. I'm going with D here. Number 1, Florida Gulf Coast. Number 2, Fairfield. Number 3, Hope. And number 4, Arkansas. Florida Gulf Coast, the number 1 seed. Number 1 in the South all season long. The SCHC champions. Fairfield, the second place team in the Empire Conference. The only team that handed Farmingdale State a loss. Hope in the Final Four for the MCHC. And Arkansas, kind of a dark horse at number 4. The SECHC tournament champions. Break down Pool D for us.
Well, Florida Gulf Coast with Jared Birch, you know, that he's a mainstay in the national tournament. I understand that they've got, they made it to the Final Four last year. Jared thinks that he has something to prove. Their coaching staff does, the whole team does. Fairfield, another team with maybe a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They've been there before, but my favorite is Hope College. I love how they're playing right now. They look so dominating in that regional tournament. As you mentioned, 14-3. Arkansas, they play in that SECHC. They beat Georgia in the conference semifinals. They won the whole thing. The goaltending to me is going to be the key in that pool.
And it absolutely is. And you talk about this as well. We like to talk about comparisons here in sports, and especially for hockey. A strong Nationals outlook for 3 of these teams, because Florida Gulf Coast 5-0 against the teams they've played in the national tournament. That's 4-0 against UCF, and that's 1-0 against Oakland this season. This Fairfield team, 6-2 against Atlantic teams. Florida Gulf Coast, they looked good against the teams that they played that are looking in the national tournament as well. For me, the big thing about this is how hot these teams coming out of regionals are. And Florida Gulf Coast and Fairfield, phenomenal seasons for them. They're both playing in some very tough conferences, what I believe to be the toughest conferences of their respective regions. The Empire is the Atlantic, and it has been, and it will continue to be. Florida Gulf Coast, between the SCHC and the SECHC, that's tough. But Hope, 14-3 winners, and they took on a Ferris State team that's going to take a few years to develop here. And for Arkansas, I mean, it's hard to discredit a team that won the conference that had Georgia in it. This high scoring, I can't pick a winner for this. That's the real reason it's my pool of death, because the way that I see it, any of these teams could move on, and any of these teams could move on and find their way to compete for that national championship. Florida Gulf Coast, like you said, they went up against the national championship winner last year in Aquinas. And when we're talking about Fairfield as well, they've played in some tough pools the last couple of years. They haven't been able to find their way to that next step. But going against Farmingdale State, getting that only win. Hope, they have played in 4 national championship games and lost all 4. You don't think Chris Van Timmeren's hungry to finally win one? You saw it in the play of Austin Kane. In that regional tournament in the North, he completely dominated out there. 3 goals on the entire weekend against 2 teams that relatively can put it in the back of the net. And Arkansas, they're a little bit more of an unknown to me, but I know what they did in that Pacific region. I know what they were able to do against that Kansas team, and the results speak for themselves with their championship.
Oh, you know, one of the most underrated goaltenders, I think, in the country is Austin Kane. You know, he looks so solid in that regional. Florida Gulf Coast right behind him. That's why I say it's going to come down to goaltending in this region as well. This pool rather. That Florida Gulf Coast and Hope College, I go back and forth between them two. It's almost a coin flip between them, in my opinion.
And you're talking about hardest schedules as well. Hope had the 2nd hardest schedule of teams remaining in the national tournament, 9th in the country. Florida Gulf Coast isn't too far behind. They're 5th, 14th hardest in the country. That's a lot of pedigree between these 4 teams. That day 1's going to be fun. Florida Gulf Coast taking on Arkansas, 2 teams that, like you said, know how to put it in the back of the net, 2 teams that know how to stop it. But Fairfield and Hope, I don't know, the winner of that game could be the one who's going to be competing for that last day. Lou, I think now comes the toughest time of the show. It's time to say who's going to move on from each pool. We're going to start with Pool A. And a recap for you, that's Air Force, Central Michigan, George Mason, and Georgia Tech. Who do you like moving on from that pool? The speedy pool.
Wow. You know what, Shawn? It's going to come down to that first day. I honestly believe that with Central Michigan playing George Mason, the winner of that game is going on. And I'm sorry, as much as I want to pick my alma mater, I'm going with George Mason in an upset in that pool.
George Mason is such a huge sleeper in that one for me. But the big thing for Central Michigan, they got punched in the mouth by Michigan to end their regular season. But since then, they've been hot in the postseason. Will they carry that over into the national tournament? If they play like the team that won 20 straight games, they move on to the national tournament semifinals. Pool B, balanced pool. Michigan State, New Mexico, Central Florida, and Quinnipiac.
I can tell you in 5 seconds, Michigan State, without a doubt. I just think they've got too much for all 3 of those teams.
Don Headley, head coach of Michigan State, a team that only lost twice this season. Their only other loss to Lawrence Tech of the NAIA. I like them to move on as well. Your pool of death, here's the tough one. Pool C, that's Farmingdale State, Georgia, Nebraska, Oakland. Who's moving on?
I got to go with who I picked at the beginning of the year. They're rolling right now. They looked impressive. Even if you think they've got shaky goaltending, I'm going with Oakland in the upset over Farmingdale State.
I'm going to go against you here. I'm going to go with the low seed as well, but I'm going with Nebraska to move on to the next round. And for Pool D, for Pool of Death, Florida Gulf Coast, Fairfield, Hope, and Arkansas.
Boy, I don't want to sound like a homer picking all Michigan teams. It's going to be between Hope College and Florida Gulf Coast. Florida Gulf Coast, I'm gonna say they're going to edge out Hope College.
And I'm going to go against you there. I'll say that Hope's going to move on to the next round. So those teams that move on, who wins the national championship?
I'm going with the Banks of the Red Cedar. It's going to be either them or Oakland. God, it's a wow. You know what? I'm going to go with who I picked in August. I'm going with Oakland all the way.
Wow. And you heard it here first. You know what? I'm going to go with Hope College to win it all this year. They've been there so many times. I think if they move out of the pool, they win the pool. They win the ship. That will do it. You can tell us when we're wrong, if we're wrong, but until then, we head down to Columbus for the ACHA D3 National Tournament in a couple of weeks. Lou and I will both be on the broadcast, and we hope you'll join us from Columbus, Ohio.